All right. Good evening to everyone that has joined us. I'm sure we'll have a few more popping in the next couple of minutes here, but we are going to get started with tonight's training, which is brought to us by the Berkshire and Franklin MRC units. I know not everyone here is necessarily an MRC volunteer. We are always looking for additional volunteers if anyone is interested. And the Medical Reserve Corps, or MRC, is a nationwide network of 200,000 volunteers that are organized locally to recruit, train, and activate medical and non-medical volunteers for the benefit of community health needs. So we have a vast array of projects that we work on in our two counties, and our presenter tonight is Liisa Jackson, and Liisa is the coordinator director of 7 other MRC units in the state of Mass. She has lots of experience with presenting on all of the MRC goals and ideals and programs, and has been involved with many projects and deployments herself. And so we refer to her expertise tonight.
Thank you so much. I look forward to getting feedback from all of you. We can all learn from each other, so this is kind of an open dialogue. You can pose questions either kind of by raising your hand and Christy will acknowledge you, or you can put something in the chat as I go through this course. And I'm going to go to the next slide. I thought this was kind of funny. Hurricane Corinne, but I was supposed to put in there was an ice storm with tornadoes, because those do actually happen. But we can say it's a hurricane too. So
hey, what you saying?
Yeah, it's a good thing. Yeah. So anyway, most of you know Incident Command. And when we work as this is a shelter manager's course, and this is for all the team leaders and what everybody does. So, you know, like when you look to the left, you see the health department. And do you guys work under EMDs or health departments mostly?
EMD, we work under both, sort of.
Okay,
I'd say more EMDs than health departments, but there is a little bit of both.
Yeah, because probably your smaller towns, the EMDs they have more bandwidth there. So like you generally, the health department or the emergency management will activate a shelter, and that's probably going to happen tomorrow. It'll be like a warming shelter, and we will probably be looking at staffing homeless shelters more than what they're regularly open. This is kind of what a general diagram looks, but everybody has a different diagram who does what. Sometimes the shelter manager is the MRC, sometimes it's a CERT leader, sometimes it's a health department person or somebody else from town. But this is kind of gives you the gist of what happens in a shelter and how it works. And each shelter will be different. Each shelter plan's different, each community is different, and really just understanding what your role in the shelter response is what's important. And really you can get all that from the shelter manager or the EMD. This is a diagram for, oh, gotcha, thank you. The training objectives are really to have a clear sheltering plan. Have you guys looked at your sheltering plans recently? Is that something we look at ours generally every year, but with COVID that kind of got delayed a little bit. I did change some of the policy during COVID just because of the restrictions we would have to adhere to. But did you guys change your sheltering plans anytime recently?
So Liisa, are you referring to the regional sheltering plans?
Yeah, is that what you guys do, or is there local shelters, or is it more of a regional shelter? What's your shelter makeup?
The counties, and actually the Berkshire County has, I guess, 3.
Yeah.
And Franklin has 1 that I know of. And so, you know, we are written into those, but we're not, you know, we don't write the policy in them, but we have our own policy, obviously, that we can.
So who organizes those? Is it a county leadership system? like the rest of the United States?
It's,
No, we did away with counties.
yeah, really.
Okay.
So
The
in
the regional-
Franklin, it's a cog, and in
Yeah.
Berkshire, it's Berkshire Planning, right?
Okay.
So it's, the regional shelters are by the Regional Emergency Planning Committees,
Okay.
with support
The
from
RIPCs, yep.
the Berkshire County Boards of Health Association, which is housed at Berkshire Regional Planning. So it's like, you know, we cobble these things together. But each town, each of the 32 towns and 2 small cities have their own shelter plans.
Yes.
And those regional plans only get activated if the local shelters can't manage.
Surge. Yeah.
So we've never had that situation. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, but
Mm.
we've got the plans in place for these, and we have backups to the back, you know, to each of the regional
Yeah.
shelters.
So there's layers of it, you
That's
know, and I
great.
always like to ask that. And I think for the participants, it's good to hear that. I see Sarah has her hand up. Do you have a question, Sarah?
No, I actually have a comment
Okay, go for it.
your question. And
Mm.
our shelter in Greenfield is actually privately run.
Okay.
And it's not a, you know, when we talk about sheltering, it's not a true emergency shelter, which means
Okay.
if you get a bed and you follow their rules, then that bed is yours to infinity. And our shelter locally has been full for about 1.5 years. So this cold weather situation, the city of Greenfield has only activated daytime warming centers. There is no overnight coverage.
I gotcha. And that's where it's kind of where they're the most vulnerable. What we've seen in some of my regions, obviously we have ongoing homeless shelters, and we do in Malden have a warming center that runs operationally from December to the end of March. And they are just open at night. But I've seen anywhere from libraries to being open, police station, training rooms being opened, kind of anywhere that has libraries aren't 24/7, but police stations generally are kind of and fire stations are kind of a good backup. So that's something we put in our plans in my regions, in Region 5 and 3. Just kind of, we look at places that are operational 24/7. So, but did that answer your question, Sarah, or did that give you, because it
No,
sounds like
I-
it's a homeless shelter
Yeah,
that you're talking about.
Yeah, I understood. I understand the structure, like how it's supposed to go, but I was just giving you a snapshot of
What
what
you-
our city looks like. There's no there are none of that. I would love to have some of what you have in Malden and Greenfield or Franklin County, because there's, you know, the shelter in Greenfield serves all of Franklin County. So I'm waiting to see the city activate some kind of something for this weekend. I don't know what that's going to look like, but we have spaces in the city that could be used, like John's On Center, that could potentially be used. They're just not being utilized right now.
Yeah, and that's part of why we're having this discussion, to ask those questions. In Lynn, we use an old building that the town owns that's not used, things like that. So there's a lot of places people can go as long as there's heat, you know, and a roof, obviously. So, and again, this is kind of what we're talking about, understanding the importance of adjusting the plan to meet local needs. And it may change depending on your situation. We have our shelter in Lynn several years ago, like 10 years ago, flooded. So then we had to come up with another plan. And then again, this is old term, but you recognize and challenge global rules that may not work in real life. All of us have these wonderful plans and we have these ideas, but as you know, when the rubber hits the road, there sometimes needs to be a lot of adaptation to make the shelter work for that particular situation. Sheltering rules, we had talked about that, and Katrina is still here, but that's probably our biggest storm that the country has had that really taught us the most. But you know, sheltering rules are always challenged because sometimes you don't don't know what you got. For example, at the Houston Astrodome, a bunch of people came with guns, and they had to figure out a way what to do with those guns. So they basically had garbage cans off the buses, and they put the guns in. So that's just one example of what it looks like. So sometimes your plans will not take care of what you have going on. So you have to someone's in the wrong training. So you have to kind of adapt to the situation, and that's why it's so important. I think unified command in a larger scale disaster is so important, because you have different people coming to the table with different resources and different ideas on how to handle certain situations. The goal is to best serve the needs of your current population. And then, of course, like with Katrina, worst case scenario was exceeded. We had that with Sandy. And we are seeing a lot more disasters than those of us that have been around for a long time saw when we began the MRC. Some plans and procedures are inadequate, and I would say, being kind, most of those plans and procedures, they're a good template to work off of. And I don't necessarily like that terminology, but it's always good to look at your plans every year and just make sure that they're still up to snuff. All the contacts are there, and really who opens the doors. Just as simple as that. So a lot of those things are really what you want to look at when you look at your plans and procedures. And those of you that are in leadership, you're going to want to really kind of have a good handle on that, even if you delegate that leadership to a volunteer or somebody else. State plans and procedures are generally inconsistent with local. And I found that almost with every disaster, but it can be managed and can be discussed with the state. And, generally if there's a large scale disaster, we're dealing with ESF 6 and ESF 8, which 6 is sheltering, ESF 8 is health. So, sometimes, and I think now most people are more bendable when it comes to sheltering, but when we started this, everybody were very rigid in how they really interpreted the plans. Okay, so headlines you didn't see. I love this one, Katrina. It's an old slide, but 1.2 million people were saved by having a personal plan. So the work we do in the community, personal preparedness, family preparedness, business preparedness works. I know I have all my stuff ready to go, and I'm sure all of you do. And if you don't, you should. So that's a big deal. FEMA assets were there actually 48 hours before landfall. And a lot of the press, that doesn't happen, but there's a lot of staging that goes on. If they expect an ice storm, generally, the power companies are staging, and those of us in public health and emergency management are kind of thinking about, like, what are we going to do? And particularly in a large hurricane, we've seen a lot of these. They're very devastating. And I think Katrina taught us a lot, but there was a lot of whispers around that they weren't there, and they were. Millions opened their cities, homes, hearts, checkbooks to meet human needs. As you know, people came to Otis Air Force Base, and a lot of those folks from Louisiana during Katrina ended up settling here or in New England. And this one probably blows my mind the most. 62,000 were rescued from rooftops and overpasses in 4 days. And you think of the austere environment it was, and even ice storms like we had in 2007, or even like, heavy snowstorms or high winds, or even the tornadoes. Just trying to get into those areas and rescue people is pretty difficult. To me, that number is incredible. What people did, what neighbors did for neighbors, EMS, fire, everybody really stepped in, and that's incredible when you think about that number. And then 1 million residents evacuated in 2 days. So a lot of times I think there's evacuation notices, and there's always those folks, particularly in Florida, that stay behind. And that's something, that's generally what we would be dealing with if we were setting up a shelter. If we had a place to set up the shelter, it would be a geographic decision depending on what the damage was and how we could transport people. Again, the 100-year flood plan, with all the things going on, that's changed. The things that were flooding 100 years, they say every 100 years, it's happening more often. Again, we look at air conditioning, heating, obviously backup power supply, adequate restroom facilities, and we don't always have those. In the gas explosions, we set up portalets and mobile showers outside. Adequate area for feeding sheltered populations. Sometimes we've had to shift, like in the ice storms, we had to do several shifts to feed people because we only had a small area. And then hopefully it's located on a public transportation route, but you know, that's usually the route that the community keeps open and the state keeps open. But if you have trees down, then you have to think about Plan B. But that's what goes into your selection of setting up and designating a shelter. You have to know your saturation point. A few of my shelters have hit that, and it's tough. When you have that, you usually bump to the next shelter, but it does happen. And sometimes you open a shelter and there's 2 people there. That's also happened as well. Again, ability to support food, clothing, and the shelter itself. Again, staffing obviously is a big deal. I try not to open the kitchens when I open a shelter unless it's absolutely necessary. At the Big E, we never opened a kitchen at the Big E. Just because that brings in a whole different slew of problems and a whole big piece of oversight. So sadly, we had a bunch of like non-perishable items, but we worked with the Salvation Army and food, things like that to deliver food. Public safety capabilities. Most police departments run on bare bones on any given day. So it's good to identify auxiliary police that you may have or volunteers that may be retired police. That's something to look at just because a lot of times when public safety, particularly in smaller communities, it's kind of all hands on deck, and to have them sitting at a shelter isn't always the best place for them. Generally, I would say 9 times out of 10, there is a police officer there, though, because we have municipal police departments. Healthcare support, that's always been a very big challenge. You get people that are dropped off at the shelter that have needs that we may not be able to meet. And how do you get them admitted? What is the criteria to get them admitted? There's been a lot of discussion to look at nursing home beds. There's a lot of things that we've developed over the years that might be a way, but it's tricky. Like, who pays for it, how those things work out. Those are conversations that you really want to have before a large scale shelter is open, because we've had cases where we sent people out of the shelter and they sent them right back. So, because they had nowhere to put them, or no family to take care of them. So that's probably been one of our biggest problems in the shelters that I've run. We get patients in there and we have cots. We don't have bariatric beds. We don't have Hoyer lifts. We don't, we might be able to get some wheelchairs and sliding boards, but some people need more of that. Sometimes the healthcare providers, the caregivers drop them off and they don't stay with them. That's something else you want to really make sure that the provider, whoever's providing that care at home, that they come into the shelter and do what they were doing at home. Regional support. I love that you guys have regional shelters. That's something we're still stumbling around with in the East, in my units, because everybody wants to do their own thing. We have a few designated regional shelters, but it's certainly not adequate to handle if it was a large scale disaster. And then we think about long-term supportive services, infrastructure, assimilation capabilities. When we had the tornadoes at the Big E, we had social workers coming in, we had all kinds of resources. A lot of those folks in that shelter didn't have they didn't have their their green cards or immigration papers or anything like that. So that was a particular challenge at that shelter. So, and actually with the ice storm in 2007, a lot of homes got flooded because everything froze and the pipes broke in the houses. So a lot of apartment buildings and things were not livable. So actually there was a guy that had finished building a big condo complex. So we worked out a deal with them, or the city of Fitchburg worked out a deal with them to have those people live in those the condos until their property was safe to go back into. So those are things you want to think about. You want to look at what types of homes you have. Obviously, you know, all hazards. I know out in your area, you guys are at the forefront at sheltering. I've stole and borrowed and taken your sheltering plans, which are amazing. So I know a lot of this is already going on, but it's good to have that discussion again. Transportation, that's a tricky one. You know, there'll be populations obviously that show up with their own transportation. How do we get clients to a shelter? A lot of times that's we don't even know about it. A lot of it gets dropped off, or people walk over, or there's a lot of different ways that people can transport. That has always been a challenge in the sheltering. The most thing that I probably have seen the most is really people driving their own transportation to the shelter or giving rides. We've talked about using school buses and doing school routes, like school bus routes. If it's a large scale disaster and you have to evacuate a whole part of a community. So that's discussion we've had in Fall River and like in New Bedford and some of our larger communities. We've talked really with the school department and worked under existing resources that are in place. And then hopefully things are supported by the Department of Social Services with transportation. So you're talking the ride or any senior transportation, those types of transportation services we've tapped into in the past to get people to shelters. Food, local restaurant donations, if they have power. Contracted vendors, that's something a lot of communities do before a shelter, and then committed volunteers. A lot of times you have a school cafeteria staff that can come in. Generally, the rule of thumb in most of our shelters is that any given time the school or the designated shelter would have 2 weeks supply of food for the total occupation of that shelter. And that's kind of what's written in the plans, but it's not always true. And it's not always really feasible to do that. So that's a discussion to have. I've found grocery stores, when the power goes out, they're more than willing to donate, you know, non-perishable items, things like that. We've opened kitchens and cooked food that was safe to cook. So there are a few ways that you can get around food. And again, Salvation Army is a great resource, but again, if it's a large scale event, they would get surged pretty quickly. Sleeping supplies, this is always challenging. The cots that all of us have are great, and I've slept on them before, but they're not always suitable for everybody. And how do you clean them? You know, so that's something, you know, like you may have people turning over, and what do you do to sanitize them? We had a nursing home come into one of our shelters and use infrared and heat sanitizer for the shelters. They come in every day, and when we would transfer over a cot to a new person, that they would be numbered or marked, and that nursing home would go in. Their staff donated their time and their supplies to do that. So that's something to think about when you do shelters, because usually what we have is a small pillow and a wool blanket and a cot in the shelters. So that's what do you do with the blankets? I don't know if you have tried to launder some of those older blankets. They're not able to be washed. So those are things to think about. And I mean, I think that's part of personal planning. Individual planning is bringing a pillow and a blanket or a sleeping bag to a shelter. Medical supplies, that's generally pretty easy to obtain, but it takes time. Generally, we can work with local hospitals. Health departments have supplies. Obviously, EMS has supplies, but that's something that kind of needs to be looked at. Most cases, EMS has been available and hospitals have been open. So generally, if anything's something your shelter can't handle, that's a 911 call and you ship them off to the hospital or figure out how to get them there. Pets. I know you guys have done a lot of planning with pets, and I talked about this on the other training last week. Pets, a co-shelter is ideal in most of my shelters. So we really set up the area, we put down the plastic, and the occupants of the shelter that have their pets there are responsible for feeding their pets and walking their pets and cleaning the cage. I find that works the best, but certainly in some cases you might have an off-site pet shelter, and then, you know, we would look at volunteers and other staff to try to take care of that. But it's a big deal, you know, because a lot of pets are not used to other people handling them and things like that. So that's something to consider, and that's part of the planning process. What at each shelter, what's your designated pet shelter? Do you have an agreement with a local boarding facility that boards dogs and cats, or a veterinarian's office or something like that? And I know you have an incredibly active DART program out in the western part of the state, and I've seen them in action, and they do amazing work. So that planning you've done is in good shape. Multi-agency coordination, it's Medical Reserve Corps, town and city health departments, fire departments, police departments. We've tapped into National Guard a lot. That's sometimes when it's a larger scale event, we can tap into them for security if the police departments are surged. Nonprofit organizations, faith-based community, and healthcare community. Really anybody and everybody. Generally, you can ask in your community if they're able to help. And usually if you put the request out there, somebody can step up, unless it's total devastation. Then you have to kind of work up the food chain, work with MEMA, or and make a request for certain items or certain types of services that you need. American Red Cross, they do have volunteers, but I found in the last many years that the MRC has really been more the stronger volunteer providers, but they definitely do have volunteers. We worked very well with Red Cross for many years. It wasn't always the case, but I found that partnership with the Red Cross is strengthened and been wonderful over the last decade. They're amazing. Red Cross is amazing with commodities, and laundry is a service that I've tapped into with the Red Cross. Mass feeding, local restaurant donations, contracted vendors, and committed volunteers like we talked about. Salvation Army, they have food services and pastoral counseling. That is something a lot of people, a lot of older folks in particular, and non-English speaking folks are not comfortable with a clinician, a mental health clinician, and that pastoral counseling we've used in a lot of our shelters, and has been a very nice and very good thing to provide. And they have multiple designations, religious designations, and then they have individual support. Non-medical, special needs, substance abusers, and mental health needs. We did discuss this at our last shelter. We did this training last week. We talked about having Narcan or naloxone in your designated shelters, or access to that, maybe an agreement with a pharmacy or EMS or whatever, so you can deal with overdoses. What do you do when they detox? That's a whole nother problem. And that's so I see that you have behavioral health first aid coming, and Narcan trainings coming soon, which is great. And then there's mental health needs. We've had group homes come into our shelters, and generally we ask the staff of those group homes to come in and take care of those folks that they already take care of. And generally we try to separate them if possible, just to kind of give them their own little stand-up shelter, just to try to alleviate issues. That's not always possible, but we've found that to be the most effective way to deal with that. And then certain other mental health needs, I mean, you'll have to really triage that as it's come in. This sounds silly, but we had drunk trick-or-treaters coming to one of our shelters. And what do you do with that? And I remember my shelter manager calling me. I'm like, well, call the police. Do we call their parents? Do we keep them there? I said, no, just let the police do it. And they had the capacity at the time. But again, just kind of keep your eyes open. And the more you talk about it, the more ideas you'll come up with, and you'll have training coming up. And Narcan is available with a prescription. It's a standing order in Massachusetts. What do you do if a sex offender registers? They are supposed to self-identify, and that's part of the admission process. Like when someone admits, we did have a registered sex offender try to come into one of our shelters a long time ago, and luckily the cop there knew. He got a good deal out of it. We PC'd him into the police station, so he got his own room and stuff like that. But that's something, and shelters, there has been a problem with that, and there are predators that come out during particularly large scale disasters. What I've done after that first incident we had, you can get a list and images of all the the sex offenders in the community. You can look that up, or you can have pictures of it, and that's something we've put into our shelters when we've activated them, is just to have that awareness so people are aware. And generally, if the picture's on the wall, the person will self-identify as well. So and it can create a problem, just because a sex offender there, obviously we don't want them in the shelter, but we also don't want the public taking things into their own hands, or when there's an austere environment, you need to also think of that possibility. We haven't seen it, but it could happen. Healthcare organizations, shelter support, mental and physical. Down the Cape, we have an agreement with Cape Cod Hospital and Cape Cod Home Care. They would actually come into our shelters and take care of occupants that needed care. So that's a really good thing. But if you get hospital surge, do we take overflow? What are our capabilities? Can the hospital bring the equipment? Do we have the staffing? And then obviously pharmaceutical support. Now it's much easier because everything's electronic, but if everything goes down electronically, that's going to be a challenge, because not a lot of us use paper anymore. Part of emergency preparedness, I always tell people to make sure they know what their prescriptions are. They have a printed out list, and who the prescribing doctor is. We've had doctors prescribe prescriptions in a pinch when we needed them, and generally we've used MRC volunteers to do that, or Board of Health members have done it. And then also you can tap into the state. We've done that before as well. Faith-based partners, they have human resources. They already have people that are staffed there. They have a built-in command structure. A lot of faith-based communities already have nurses and clerical staff and food service volunteers. I've seen churches come in, like Halifax. When Nemo came, Halifax, we ran the shelter and only did the medical piece. They ran it at their church, and the church actually took care of that whole community for the sheltering piece of that. And we are happy to support in any way. It wasn't the designated shelter, but that was what worked best in that particular situation. Fire department, triage, treatment, transport, mass decontamination, EMS response, and off-duty volunteers. I'm sure all you know, fire departments are an incredible resource, and but they do get surged. So, but you obviously generally your fire chief or police chief or your emergency management directors too. So you have a good tie into that. Law enforcement, like I said, we've tapped into the National Guard. for shelter security and auxiliary police and things like that. Most of my shelters have had local police department inside and outside of the shelter. Just luckily they had the resources to provide it, but there could be a case where that couldn't happen. So here's our shelter scenario. So we're going to go into kind of solving the problems that may come up. Thousands of people are evacuated to local shelters after being forced from their homes due to a winter storm that brought tornadoes. So those do happen, and this is a new scenario that I thought, I was like, wow, I didn't know that could actually happen, but it does. So that I put that into this particular training. The first thing you look at is, who are your residents? Who are you going to be sheltered? Who's affected? You can usually find that information out pretty quickly, because usually if 911 is working, you're getting calls. You can identify areas now. There's a lot of ways that there's drones. A lot of my communities have drones, and they can go over an area and take a look at what it looks like, and what the needs in that area are. But when you start setting up a shelter, generally what we look at, and this is our rule of thumb, we set up a general population shelter and trigger it to a medical shelter when that becomes needed. Hopefully, general population shelters, there's usually no disabilities, but now you can't deny anybody to come into your shelter unless it's a safety risk. So I really consider all general population shelters a medical shelter. So when you do your plans, that's the way I do it. Red Cross for many years, and still do, they provide Band-Aids and really very simple medical support, but the Medical Reserve Corps can come in and backfill that with their doctors and nurses. Special needs shelters are individuals requiring additional assistance. Individuals requiring constant medical attention and care is tricky. We've done it. Generally, if someone's homebound, they'll have their own oxygen. If they have dialysis or at home or something like that, we've figured out ways to handle it. It's generally bringing in the folks that already care for them into the shelter. Shelter populations include patients, their immediate family, and caregivers. That's one of my pet peeves, is when people drop off people that need care. That care team needs to come into that shelter and support that person. And then it's supported by the State Department of Public Health and local hospitals and local boards of health. So hopefully that all gets, the RAPCs you mentioned, that discussion is happening, and you kind of have a plan if you get people in your shelter that you can actually care for appropriately, and that does happen.
Lisa, excuse me, do you actually open both a general population and a special needs? Because we've decided that's redundant, because there's so many special needs.
It's both. It's integrated.
Right.
It's a general shelter with special, that
Right.
function to it.
Right.
And that's always written into it. Some people just still want to do just general shelters. And then what we've done, if that community doesn't have capabilities of with special needs, then we can figure out transport to another community. So
because we have such an elderly population in Berkshire County that we assume,
Yes.
most of the people in our shelter is going to have something.
Yes, hearing aids or something. Yeah,
walkers, whatever.
Yeah, and down south, not North Shore as much, but in Region 5 and obviously the Cape, we have a similar population. But along the southern coast, same thing. That's what we anticipate. And bathrooms are challenging, like Nemo and Marshfield. We had a school that we used as a shelter, and they had their little tiny toilets that elementary schools have. So there was a lot of, and again, there was mostly an elderly population that needed some assistance. So, it was really a medical shelter. But again, like what I said, is we anticipate that. We start as a general shelter and then expand and contract as the shelter needs come. Job action sheets are really important. Every time I deploy general volunteers, and you guys have great job action sheets because I've used yours, you give that particular volunteer a job action sheet, and the person that's the team leader should be obviously very well aware of what the responsibilities are. I should say within job action sheets, and I always write this as a note, that there's supplies in there, and you may not have those supplies, and if you need those supplies, you request them in the job action sheet. Obviously in the job action sheet, who you report to is at the top. Again, the supplies, sometimes that comes in dribs and drabs, particularly, when the shelter's activated and the doors are open, you probably won't have everything you need. But then as you start looking at what your needs are, that stuff can start coming in. And if you can't do it in your community, that's what MEMA's for. Your emergency management director or the shelter manager should be working with MEMA to get some of those supplies if they can't get it locally. What do you do during the activation stage? Generally, when you're operating, there's a lot of downtime, and it's lights out, and just basic needs of humans that you're taking care of. So whether it's food services or dormitory or medical or behavioral health or registration, that would all be within your job action sheet. And then what are some of the typical actions, what you may be asked to do during that activation or ongoing operations or deactivation or change of shift. So that ideally should be in all your job action sheets, and all of you, I'm quite sure. Anybody not familiar with job action sheets? All right, good. So again, registration, kind of things to think about. How do you identify residents? There's been a lot of things that we've done. We've done index cards where they sign their name and you put their bed number in there and their emergency contact. When they walk in, they carry that index card because the sign-in sheet can get messy. That was one thing that we found, and I put in every one of my sheltering kits a bunch of those index cards with all that information as the occupant comes in. We've set up that card. If they leave, they drop the card in a box so we know that they've left. And when they come back in, they pick up that card again so we know that they're back. And then obviously a backup sign-in sheet. But that has been a way that we've found that works really well, because a lot of times, as most of you know, there's a lot of coming and going at a shelter, particularly if it's long term. They may get a call from their buddy like saying, hey, I'm going to come pick you up, and they're outside. So the cards are a really nice way to kind of really keep track of those occupants. How to identify families? We've used numbers, we've used letters, we've used wristbands and put Jackson on the last name or assignment to certain areas. That's always a good thing to do. Always hand out, it says when to hand out rules and regulations. You always do it. And generally most shelters, you want to have a briefing in the morning and a briefing in the evening of what's happening at the shelter to the occupants. Again, I talked about how residents leave and return to the shelter and who's going to monitor and take care of pets. We did talk about that, but at registration, again, we've used those color-coded bands. I learned that from your DART program, the color-coded bands with an image of the pet and the owner. So they have an image of the pet and the cage has an image of the owner. So there's no pet napping or problems with that. So those are things you want to think about within your planning. Dormitory, this is always challenging when you're setting up your shelter. You have single men, you have single women, you have families, you have elderly, you have medical, you have special needs. Potentially, like I talked about, a group, if a group home comes in or something comes like that, you kind of want to segregate them a little just to have that control, and you want to have those areas labeled. A lot of that just comes as shelter occupants come in. You can set that all up and you'll get no single men coming in or no single women. So you kind of set that up as the shelter evolves. Scheduling, activities, meals, lights out, showers. The scheduling is really important because people want to understand where they stand. generally we put up a big board, a dry erase board, and that information is up there all the time. Lights out at 10, lights on at 7, breakfast is served at 8, you know, things like that. Again, the rules are incredibly important because that's what you have to back up on. If somebody's arguing with you or they bring alcohol in or drugs or weapons, that's something that those rules need to be pretty much, as far as I'm concerned, in every area, just so people understand them. And we've had to translate them depending on the shelter population. So that's another thing that's important. Medical, how do you handle behavioral problems? Though, that's, again, you know, you bring in specialist people that understand how to do that. Also, the training you have coming up can teach everybody on how to do psychological first aid, or, you know, how to mitigate, or how to identify potential behavioral problems, you know, like by body language, and how to talk to those folks and really kind of de-escalate them and get them in a separate area. Where do ill residents go when they sleep? This is something we talked about quite a bit. Our homeless shelters, thank God we didn't set up any real shelters like mass shelters, but in our homeless shelters, we had them separated, everyone wore masks, and obviously followed DPH requirements or CDC requirements. How do patients get their meals? Sometimes you don't have a place for people to dine. We have people eating outside at the Big E all the time because we didn't have a big dining area. So that's something to think about. And do you do it in shifts? Like some of our shelters, we've done it in shifts. And how do you identify residents with allergies? One thing I do, obviously on the intake form, you identify allergies, but I look at that person that, unless they can't do it, that they self-identify any allergies like they do in a restaurant. Anywhere that they go, they have, unless it's something that's medically that we need to intervene with. But I really recommend that you have residents identify their, you know, be responsible for their own allergies. Cooking staff, school cafeteria staff, who's going to do it? We've had people that work in restaurants. We've trained volunteers with Serve Safe, so they know how to warm up and give food. Again, personal responsibility with the allergies, meal hours. If you get a vat of peanut butter and bread that's donated to the shelter, and there's a person with a peanut butter allergy, you may want to, and someone's freaking out about it, you have the medical person triage it, identify what the problem is, and maybe they eat the food in a different room. But it's really their personal responsibility. We can't keep track of everybody's allergies. Again, meal hours, what about snacks, where, when? Generally, we don't like people eating in the dormitory area or obviously the bathroom area. And then what about special diets? We try to keep the general diet pretty bland. Although I've gone to shelters and had some of the best chicken soup I've ever eaten. I'm like, you got to make it taste worse, so we're never going to get people out of here. But again, just kind of, you know, just a really simple diet, that low sodium, you know, low sugar, things like that, that can be managed by most populations. Section chief. So you have your shelter manager. They oversee all aspects of the shelter. And that shelter manager usually reports to either the EMD or whoever's in charge of sheltering in that community. You have your medical director that would deal with medical issues. Obviously, staffing coordinator, that's usually us MRC coordinators, or we may have an on-site staffing coordinator, clinical unit supervisor, clerical unit supervisor, dormitory leader, and food services. Mental health, we usually put under medical. So that's an adjunct of that. We don't usually have a separate mental health director, but those are your section chiefs. And that's kind of what you want to look at. And that's, they handle all aspects of the shelter.
So Lisa, who takes care of sanitation and, you know, keeping the bathrooms and the floors clean and stuff like that?
So the way we looked at that, and we've had that, as much as we like to try to plan for that, a lot of times there's janitorial services within the school, but we ask the occupants to clean up after themselves. And then if we need volunteers to come in and clean, then we would probably do it section by section. And that leader of the dormitory or food services or really where the bathrooms are, which would be part of dormitory, that would be something that they decide. And ideally, one of my shelters, I spoke about this, it was the Big E. I walked into the bathroom. It's a great 4-H bunkhouse for, but there was like a line of mirrors and a bunch of sinks and disposable toothbrushes unwrapped on the top of the and I put on a glove and I'm like, and then you come up with a policy. So a lot of that stuff, like everybody keeps their own toothbrush with them. They don't leave it there. It's not their home. So a lot of things like that, you just kind of mitigate as it comes, and hopefully you don't have that. I was horrified when I walked in there. I'm like, this is 5 days in, there's all toothbrushes not covered, but again, did that answer your question, Sandra, without
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So our first scenario is, and we're going to talk about this as a team. Your local shelter is open. You don't have medical staffing on site. A resident in your community comes and has ambulatory issues and is incontinent. Do you accept him into your shelter at that time? And everybody can take a turn answering, because how many people do we have on this call?
We have 19.
19. All right, so how do we want to do this, Christy? Because I would like everybody to kind of give an answer on this, and we're doing just fine on time. You want to just go through,
Sure.
have people raise their hand and we acknowledge them, and then some people may not say anything.
That works
Answer
for
in the
me.
chat. What do you think?
The,
Let's do the
yeah,
chat,
let's do
unless
chat, yeah.
somebody has comments beyond that. So everybody put in the chat what you would do with this scenario. And then any questions you have, just certainly raise your hand and we'll. If they have a care, yes, excellent. One says, ask if they have a caregiver with them that can care for them. Number one question. Suggesting another option. There may be shelters in the area that already have medical needs or capabilities. See if there's a nursing home or a hospital. Absolutely. That's important. Info, are they in a wheelchair? So that's information you would gather. I'm gonna just drop this chat down a little bigger. Again, nursing home possibly. Accept him. Generally, if there's nowhere to go, we accept him. If you can't figure out an alternative way, you keep them there until you find a place for them. That's kind of what we look at. Still in diapers. How do you accept an adult? That's different. Hopefully a child with diapers has a parent. Same with a person, adults with depends or adult diapers. They would have a person that helps it, or they may manage that themselves. A lot of people do that themselves. But again, that's part of the triage. Like this is there's lots of people that are incontinent that live a pretty normal life and manage it themselves. And, it may have ambulatory issues. So all these questions you said are perfect, call for backup medical services if needed. Check to see if there's a PCA and they need it. Because it's interesting, when I wrote this scenario, you kind of need to triage it and see what this actually means. Like, they may say I'm incontinent, but that they have a bag full of Depends or they have a catheter or whatever. So again, you just really triage that. I think we need more information. Is this individual? So let's say he is totally incontinent, unable to get himself to the bathroom or can't change his own Depends. We've had this has happened. And We didn't have staff at the time. I sent out an alert to volunteers to get staffing. We had nowhere to send them at the time, so we dealt with it. He was okay waiting until the volunteers got there that we needed. The supplies were at a couple doors over. The cops went down and got a raised commode and things like that. So, you know, you just kind of look at what your resources are. You can't always place them. You know, there's an insurance issue there, you know, like, are you going to send them to the hospital? If they won't admit them for that, they won't take them. And I see Sandra shaking her head, or a nursing home. You have to have a legitimate reason for them to be admitted. So then what do you do?
This isn't really medical.
Yeah.
None of these things are medical, and the
No.
hospital will not take them.
No,
So-
absolutely not. So like, what do you do? And in the past, you know, and Sandra, do you have any stories of dealing with this type of situation you could share? Or
Well,
anybody else?
It's just that you can't turn away anybody. I mean, basically during an emergency, you have to figure out the best spot for them, but you can't basically say no, except unless they're a danger. You know, if they're a
Yes.
danger to the other
A
occupant,
security
you know, if
risk,
they're
yes.
waving guns or something, you can turn
Yeah,
away.
yeah.
But so you have to figure it out. And in this case, they just need a personal care attendant, maybe. And I think
Maybe,
your intake is exactly right. You've got to ask the questions during whoever's registering's got to be smart and ask the right questions. And then you start looking for the proper place for them.
Yeah. Anybody else have any stories they want to share on that? But Sandra is right. I mean, like, we really have to accept them, and we can't send them away if we don't have a place for them to go that's more appropriate for their stay. Transportation, we've done this in between my shelters. I've had shelters pretty close together, and one had a high medical staffing and had no medical staffing. We had a person that came in with similar issues, and we actually worked with Busy Bee, is the transportation in the area. They came and picked up that person and brought them to the other shelter where we had more suitable. We had bariatric cots there. We had medical staff. It was in a senior center, so we had already raised commodes and handles and stuff like that. But great feedback. Any questions about this scenario? Anything before I move on to the next one? All right. And this might be something you put in a script. A lot of times I will write a script for registration, and I've used a decision tree before. So like, if you don't understand it and you need to refer it to medical on-site or off-site to triage it, or if it's a behavioral health problem, do you refer it on-site or off-site? Generally, if it goes above your head, you would tell that person to go to their team leader, which would be the clerical unit leader, and hopefully they would tap into other resources. But again, it's very important to really triage it well and really figure out what the actual needs are. Because it could be someone that's self-contained. They take care of themselves, they got it kind of handled, and they have ambulatory issues, but they just need to charge their wheelchair, you know, something like that. So let's see. Let me see if I can get this. Where did my cursor go? I don't know. I can't advance the slide. I'm sorry. Hold on. There it goes. All right. So this is very good for your region. Your shelter is open. You have been requested to make your shelter into a regional shelter. You are getting pushback from your town officials. And what steps do you take to make this shelter open and make it to happen? I see Sandra smiling, but it's always a delicate massage with local officials. But go ahead.
So the biggest issue with a regional shelter that we found is who pays.
Yes.
So that is, you know, so there's the host community where the physical shelter is located, but if it's a regional shelter, and I think this is the big barrier in the eastern part of the state, is if you're in another town and, you know, are hosting a, so
Right.
it's who
They
pays.
can't ask for reimbursement. I mean, that's, yeah.
So we have agreements saying everybody's going to pay for the shelter. It's not just the host community, and that's how
So
our
prior
regional shelters-
MOU.
a prior MOU agreement, a mutual aid agreement that specifies everybody will contribute to the costs.
That's awesome. And we've set up MOUs on the fly before. So that's not out of the realm of, but again, setting up things on the fly, I've had a mayor come in and not want to do,
So
and like
another,
you have to try to talk them off the cliff and,
right,
know,
and
talk
the
to,
other issue is the fairness issue is a larger community opens a shelter. How can you stop people from the neighboring community that need to come someplace from coming in the
can't.
door?
Yeah.
You really can't turn them away.
Yeah.
And so it's a fairness issue that people have to recognize that people are going to go to the nearest place. They're not going to go to the one that's necessarily in their town.
Right. Or they might not even be able to get to it.
Or
Depending on the
that's exactly
situation.
right. The roads
Yeah.
might be down or whatever, or there might not be one open.
Right.
So-
Right. It's all comes together.
Yeah.
Anybody else have that mayor who resists will not look good in the press? Yeah, you could use that. I've had different situations where, it's you remind them that,
You drop it
very
down if you have
nicely,
to.
but you say, well, it'd be, how does this look on the community? Like you don't throw them under the bus. You have to kind of be diplomatic. You have to make them think it's their idea. That's what I always say, and that's the best way to do it. But, again, that's why it's important to know your city officials, to have these plans in place and at least have a discussion on what happens and the potential of I have communities that are like, absolutely, a regional shelter is awesome. Like Plymouth has done that in the past, and Middleborough's they have a great old town hall that kind of works, you know what I mean? So, some communities, and you have a mayor that's like welcomes everybody. And then you have someone that's like, oh my God, no way. We are not taking anybody from any town other than ours, so that's always kind of some challenges that you come across. Anybody have comments, questions, stories you want to share?
I have a comment. I think it's for us out here in the wild, wild west.
Yes.
I think the regional works because we don't have places that are compacted like the city does in the east. So I think, when you were talking, I was thinking about our emergency management director, which is the fire chief. And he's always reasonable. And, I was remembering when we had a flood several years back, it flooded out the lower portion of a housing project. My grandmother happened to be flooded out. And it's the first time I actually seen a sheltering operations happen. And this was many, many years ago before I even joined MRC, when it was still at the high school. And so I kind of saw like how they approached that, how the medication, my grandma was on meds. I mean, it really was done in a way that just very quickly. So yeah, I mean, and when I think of the city officials, I think of more of like talking about unsheltered folks, that, often we keep having these conversations in the city, and it's like, we've been talking
What do we do with this?
2017 about folks that are unsheltered, and we don't have a viable plan. And I have a question for maybe Corinna or Carmela can answer this, but the high school used to be our designated emergency shelter, right? So when there's an emergency declared, that's where folks, and that's where they were sent. But when the high school was rebuilt, the fire chief told me that it's no longer the designated shelter because of the rebuilding. So I'm wondering if either of those two ladies have an answer for me, because I don't know.
I remember this question coming up before, and I can't remember what the answer is, but I think it might be the junior high.
So
But I'm sorry, I don't remember.
there is a regional shelter plan for Franklin County, and I believe it's on our website, but if it's not, Sarah, we can get it to you. The question is, was it revised since the building?
Oh,
So
sure. I'm sure it was. I mean, it would probably be on the FERCog website as well, under emergency management.
I'm looking to see if it's on there right now.
Yeah. And this is beautiful. This is why we have these discussions. Like it's real world. I saw Tony. Do you want to tell us about your situation? I saw you put a comment in the chat. Maybe he doesn't have a speaker. He said we had a similar problem with pushback from the city's mayor during our recent bomb cyclone blizzard last month. So do you want to speak about it tonight? Oh, no microphone. Okay, well, thank you for putting it in the chat. Was I assume, and you can answer this in the chat, was it resolved? Or how was it resolved? I always remind, one, you want to make them think it's their idea, but you remind them that this is a community effort. We're all working this together, and just kind of, you can sometimes redirect that, that need that a lot of local officials have to protect or to get notoriety. And that's something that's really important because, you know, people, there's a lot of egos that pop up during disasters. And I see the smiles on Sandra's done this probably longer than I have. And the egos, it's really good to remind people, and I have an ego, everybody has an ego, but like, how do you remind them that we're really all in this to come together? I know you're upset about this, but what's the resolution? And usually being a voice of reason is the best way to handle that, instead of telling someone to go to hell or whatever, you know. So, you know, and I know that's hard sometimes in the moment, you know, but that, you know, I always try to remind any of those officials, and it comes up all the time, or some local politician shows up with a newspaper on his side, you know, wanting to get press about it. So those are things that, Carmela, yes.
I'm just wondering who would actually be in that conversation.
Right. It really should go up the food chain. So it should be this. So it really should be the EMD. But what I've seen is actually a mayor will show up, or a local city council, or some other person that's involved in the elected official comes into the shelter and starts asking questions and making things happen. And, you know, like, are we a local one? Or, you know, it's something that comes up because they don't know. Elected officials, I'm an elected official. I've been on Parks and Rec for 3 years. There's been people on Parks and Rec for 10 years. So there's a lot of institutional knowledge I have, so I may have questions. So that's something that does happen. And I'm glad you brought that up, Carmela, because ideal it would be the EMD, that any of that information, or the PIO, or whatever, or the unified command, everybody make those decisions. But again, you want to kind of, everybody needs to be aware you may have to field some of that. Did that answer your question, or do you have any feedback on it?
Just, you know, what I'm imagining is an MRC volunteer is doing the intake at registration, and someone comes in and, you know, how do we, I mean, this training is one way, but, you know, would you put that in the job sheet? If somebody comes in and starts pushing their weight around, send them
Go to your team leader. I mean, it goes up the food chain, you know.
I know some volunteers would try to fix that problem.
Right. You might only have 2 registration volunteers at your shelter. So that could be, and then those of us as a coordinator, I have volunteers call me. I always say, if there's any question, and sometimes you can get surged, knock on wood, I haven't been yet in these situations, but I'm like, call me. And, you know, that person can sit there for a minute. They're not allowed in the shelter unless they're an occupant. And, you know, yeah, it's hard, you know, and you live in a community. Like, I know half the people that live in Hopkinton. Am I really going to be like, wait a minute, Dan, you know, step back? And, you know, so, you know, a lot of it's some of your own discretion, but you can fall back on the rules in ICS with that. That's the safest way to go, you know. But did that help?
Yeah.
It's a tricky question. It's like, you know, and it depends on the personality and who comes in, and, you know,
how long you've been there, and
yeah.
how
I mean,
short
one thing I always tell volunteers, if there's any situation that makes you uncomfortable, go to your team leader or to me. If the team leader's not there, they don't have access to them, I will find who they need to talk to. And that's kind of a blanket statement. And I put that in my email. I said, if there's any situation that makes you uncomfortable, go to your team leader first, you know, and that could be the shelter manager. They might be only one registration person and the shelter manager there, but the next above, and then go from there. Chrissy, I see you have your hand up.
I do. I found an answer for Sarah regarding
awesome.
Greenfield. So on the FERCOG website, I just typed in shelter plan, and their 2016 version is what's available online. So there may still be a possibility that it was updated since then and just hasn't been posted online. But it looks like Greenfield actually has several locations. The Franklin County Fairgrounds, Greenfield Community College. The high school is listed as one of them on here. Again, that part maybe, I know that was the question itself. There's a couple of other indoor action sports, Life Skills Inc., Stoneleigh Burnham School, and the YMCA are all on that list. And if anyone is interested, it is actually a full page list of all of Franklin County. So every town seems to have at least one location, and it specifies whether they're a primary. It looks like, oh, I take that back. Greenfield, the primary is Greenfield Middle School at this point. The high school is listed as a backup for unique situations, it says. So if anyone is interested in their town, it's a very nicely formatted list that'll give you that information.
Thank you. And now it's another time to, this will trigger you looking at your sheltering plans as well. But I'm going to just go through a couple of the questions. So Wendy, you brought up, you know, in this particular scenario, when the LAPC plan or REC plan or emergency response plans lay this out, ideally, it would lay it out, but a lot of times it's not. In my regions, not so much. It would happen ad hoc, and it would be whoever offered, and we would take them up on the offer. We would beg and find a regional shelter. So ideally, that's what you want, the LAPC and REPC plan to manage this. And I've been noticing REPCs are kind of folding a little because people kind of circled the wagons with COVID. It's maybe a good time to have a discussion in your community, say, hey, when's the RPC meeting again? And then you, that's why we have these classes and this discussion, so you can bring that up and start that again. Not if they follow the instructions, Corinne. And then, and I like what Corinne said, and we aren't not suggesting that volunteers don't have skills. I always tell my volunteers, you bring a specific skill set that you've learned in your life, professionally, within your family, socially, that you bring to the table. And if you have a good skill set for that and you feel comfortable using that and it's not outside of your authority, then use it, you know? So that's, thank you for bringing that, Corinne. Indoor action doesn't exist. What does that mean, Wendy? If you're able
Indoor
to...
action was one of the shelter locations that I mentioned.
Oh, yeah, I got you.
Yeah,
okay.
It was sold recently. It's been closed for years. So that plan is very out of date. That's on the website. And I saw Christy's gonna get the newest one up there.
See if they have an update somewhere.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. And then when volunteers arrive for duty at shelter, how do they get assigned to their station? Generally, we do that, the coordinator, because we'll get a request from the shelter of what's needed. Usually it's pretty simple. It's just a couple people there, or, you know, the facilities managers open up the shelter and we need a couple people there just to be ready. What I do, and I'm sure you guys do the same thing, the other coordinators, is you send off a job action sheet, you assign them a role. But I should say there's a caveat to that. Sometimes you'll send a medical person and there's no need for medical help. And that medical person may offer to be in registration or to work in dormitory. Same with, you know, maybe a medical person comes and is working in dormitory and they see there's a medical need and we verified them as a clinician, they can step over into medical. So that can be triaged as it goes along, but ideally we would send along that information. For someone who's run a lot of shelters and managed a lot of shelters, the situation is ever changing, always. And that's why you have briefings twice a day with your team and you figure out what the needs are. And then as those needs adapt, they may adapt in the middle of the night. You do your best to accommodate. So let me see anything else. We did, and thank you, Corinne, about people taking incident command so they understand the command structure. There's always a lot of discussion about people, you know, why do they have to take it? It's just so they have a good understanding of what their role is. And again, that's really important because I've had volunteers go early on when I didn't know as much, and they have a strong role in their church. So they come in and, okay, I can do this, you know, so it's really important to assign that role when they go to the shelter. And again, that job action sheet lays out what the role and responsibilities are. And and then Corinne, I see that it goes directed by the connector, point of clarification. Perfect. So any questions or comments on this scenario? It's a tricky one, but it's fixable. Thank you for all your input on that. So let me go to the next one. All right, your sheltering is opening in 2 hours. You need cots and cleaning supplies. How do you get these items and who do you call? And put it in the chat and we'll see what we got in there. For me, it's all over the place. We do inventory every year in most of my units and shelters, so we know what's where. And then we would request the closest. Sue, you have your hand raised. Do you want to say anything?
I just wanted to say something about the previous scenario, which was simply that's a planning issue. Like we should already know, we should already anticipate that we're going to be called upon to be a regional shelter, and we should already have the funding, the planning, and the plan of action in place. That shouldn't have to wait until there's actually emergency.
Agreed.
In my opinion.
I agree with you. And you know, that's why we have these trainings, because it reminds everybody of what we should be doing to make it go as smooth as possible. And if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But ideally that's why we have these trainings, and everybody will do it. Thank you, Sue, for that. That's perfect. Let's see. So Sheriff's Department, they are great. That's from Wendy. They get out here. So they'll deliver. You have a central supply of cots and things. So it sounds like you already know where it comes from. Corinne said our volunteers are not deployed under these circumstances. Oh, so you wouldn't have a volunteer go and open up a shelter or a team leader?
Not unless that was a specific request.
Okay, gotcha.
But we wouldn't, typically a shelter is going to be opened before we are asked, before we begin sending volunteers.
Yeah, it's interesting.
In a perfect world.
Yeah, it could happen. You know, it's good to have the discussion. But again, you would work up the food chain if you don't know the answer. I've had many volunteers open shelters because I teach kind of this class, and we develop team leaders a lot in our units. And they're trained to open the shelter, but I've had situations where we had no other choice. So the facilities manager meets them there and opens the door, and then we chase down where the cots and cleaning supplies are. A lot of times, ideally, I like it housed in where the shelter is, but that it might be in the attic of the town hall.
So Lisa,
that's happened.
So
yeah.
Lisa, under those circumstances, who has requested MRC support?
Well, in this, so as this is a shelter manager's course. As a shelter manager or a team leader, so this is, if you open up the shelter, you're the shelter manager, and they're like saying, hey, Corinne, I'm not the shelter manager, but I'm the one that would connect the dots. So my local health department or my EMD would say, hey, Lisa, I'm sending a couple EMTs to head over there. And we need volunteers to take their place because we need all hands on deck. And I've sent volunteers to man the shelter locally, and then I would be responsible. I would work with that EMD and tease out where those cots are. And I've had volunteers go pick them up and load them up in the back of their trucks and take them there. So I know that's not everybody does that, but I've done it. Sue, I see you have your, did I finish that question, Corinne? Did that answer?
Yes.
What?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Sue, you have your hand up again. What would you like to say?
No.
Never mind. Okay. Okay. So it depends on the type of shelter, the town or county situation. And again, triaging. So like, where is it? Kind of what I alluded to. Like if somebody's like, hey, Lisa, can you send a couple volunteers? I'm like, I'm going to want a couple cots there because if this is an overnight shelter, you know, and we've used wrestling mats as beds before when we in lieu of cots. So kind of think outside the box. Those things are in the gymnasium, and if you get a handful of people or a family that comes in, you can pull out one of those mats, sanitize it, and it can work. So thinking outside of the box. Schools have cleaning supplies, and cots can come from Armory, which is great. So Sarah, where are you from? Where does your location? I say
Greenfield.
Green. Oh, Sarah, I'm sorry. That's,
Yeah.
I didn't know if there was another Sarah. So that, you know, the schools do have cleaning supplies, and generally that's at the spot, but sometimes you can't open the janitor's closet. You know what I mean? So there's some things like that. And then I've actually gone as far as if volunteers have the supplies, or if somebody can, you know, a lot of times you have to kind of work outside the box, and it's not in the plan, but ideally you would have access to it. And that's why we have this discussion on this training is who has the keys to the closet, who has the access to the area the cots are, how do you get to that stuff? Because everything's locked now. I mean, we've gone to schools and I'm sure there's a bunch of cleaning supplies in the closet, but we had no alternatives. So in our trailer, we had a bunch of hand sanitizer and disinfecting wipes, you know, so who has the key to the trailer? Yeah, you know what I mean? So that's, you know, why we have this discussion is because like when you look at your own space and how are you going to get these supplies? And if you can't get them, what are you going to do? You know, so that's something to think about. So maybe look at the other cleaning supplies. Christy, our local RPC, should already have plans, should's the operative word, in place, and perhaps additional resource options known as well. And again, so this is an opportunity for all of you to reach out to those that leadership, maybe share this training video, or ask some of the questions that have come up. Hey, like we want to update our plans. Who is the person that can actually access these supplies, and where are they? I mean, there's schools that are huge. So where is that janitor's closet, or where is that access to the attic? So that's something. A lot of times the sheltering plan will only show where the dormitory is, and where food services is, and where medical is. It doesn't show where those supplies are. There are some supplies in the MRC trailer. I tap into that all the time. And maybe call upon churches, YMCA. YMCA is amazing. We've used them for showers many, many, many times for warming shelters. And most of them will have hours out. I have never had a YMCA say no to me. I'll say, hey, setting up a shelter in Framingham, can I offer showers between 8 and 10 after you close? And they're like, absolutely. So, you know, a little bit, that discussion's better to happen before the actual event, but I've made that call many times and been lucky. And same with health clubs, or like you said, churches, or maybe you know, like a overnight camp that's not in use, things like that. Check the list of cots, Sue said that, and cleaning supplies. Again, that's why we have this training. So if we don't know that answer, we find out. So that's what this is for. It seems like there should be more of a discussion. Do we have practice drills? And we're post-COVID now. Well, not post-COVID. We're safer now and are getting back to drills and trainings, and that's what we do. We find out where stuff is. Stuff gets moved. Staff changes, and that's why you ideally review your plans every year. And then Deerfield Academy has supplies and security on duty 24/7. And that's huge. So you have a security guard that has access to make sure they have all that, and as would Stoneley and Eaglebrook and GCC, whatever that is, Greenfield Community Center, I assume, or whatever that acronym is.
That's a community college, and the other three are
community
residential
okay,
schools.
got you. Awesome. Thank you. And that's good to know. And again, know who holds the keys, and you know, how do you access them? What's the on duty on call officer, if there's a main number? And that's why we discuss that, because then you start thinking, like, do I know that? And if you don't, then you jump down that rabbit hole and find out. Another scenario, you have set up your shelter. I'm looking at the time. Do you want me to continue with time because it's 7:30 and go through this scenario one more? How's everybody feeling?
It's fine with me. If people need to check out, please, feel free, and know that we're going to, we are recording this. And so it will be sent in a follow-up email. So you can always get on and read the, watch the ending.
Awesome. Thank you. So I just wanted to do a time check. So our next scenario is you set up a shelter and it has been open for many days. You've received, and this is a real scenario that I've had, you've received so many donations for the victims of the storm. You have a large room that's been filled with clothes, household items, and it's becoming overwhelming. And what do you do? And I'm going to just share my story real quick on this. The mayor came up and said, that's my stuff. And I'm like, well, I have friends at the Salvation Army. They can come pick it up, wash it, and then we can talk to all the occupants and see what they actually need. Nope, we're not going to do that. I'm like, that's fine. You handle that station. And I laugh. Those of you that know my daughter, she was pretty young at that time. She was like 6 years old with her MRC shirt and MRC hat. And like, yeah, 6 years old telling the mayor to manage his own stuff, because like we just didn't have the capacity to have volunteers, and people were literally dropping off their attic, cleaning out their attic, and in good intentions, obviously. But he finally came around to his senses after I explained. I said, well, this is a good way for sanitation, and Salvation Army can come pick it up, and anything that's not used can go back to other people that need it. And, it took a half-hour discussion, but that's how we handled that. In our case, and the Salvation Army came and picked it up. And then once a week, or when people were discharged or were able to leave, the day before or so, we would try to find out what needs they had. And even if they came back and picked it up, we had it set up for them. So I'll let you guys start putting in comments. Mutual aid groups, marginalized vulnerable groups. What's left? Excellent, Sarah, perfect. And that's what we did. Anybody else have a comment or a story they want to share? Or what would you do? Thought about what you would do in this situation? And this happens a lot. Was someone at the door to turn away any drop-offs? That's tricky. Who's that person that's going to say that? Oh, I'm sorry, and what we did in that case, people did drop off, although in the biggie, they had to get in there, get past security. But a shelter without that, we'd say, hey, do you mind taking it to the Salvation Army? They're processing all of our stuff. So let's see. Press releases are huge from the beginning, that cash is the greatest need, in a reputable place that the city or community recognizes. So that's pre-planning, which is awesome. I'll say that. Put up signs where to take the donations. That's also an easy way, because imagine just standing out there and being like, oh, and you could put up a nice big sign and say, please go to the Salvation Army or at this address or this church. Perfect. So maybe that's something you put in your Go Kit. You know, you have a sign that you already have an agreement with whoever that can take those items, and I, from a public health standpoint, a lot of times you don't want that coming into the shelter because you don't know, you know, if it's a blanket, if it has bed bugs or something like that. So, and would it be appropriate to, Eve, you're asking, would it be appropriate? Absolutely, as long as the shelter manager and the community that's hosting the shelter agrees. You don't do it on your own. Of course, you go up the food chain. So again, that's like the story I told about the mayor. Keep the public informed via social media, radio, obviously. Donation management and disaster is a whole thing. Ideally, there will be designated locations in advance and a public information officer, ideally. So again, when we talk about this, if you don't know the answer to this, find the answer and come up with a plan before you have truckloads of stuff dropped off at your, because the mayor's like, hey, bring stuff down to the shelter, you know, tell the guy at the gate, you know, that, and I didn't even know about it until my volunteers are like, what's all this stuff? So, you know, so what do you, any comments, questions about this particular situation? So with that, I'm going to end. I'm just going to go very quickly. We talked about identifying resources, partner organizations, local businesses, policy and training, identified shelter resident helpers. We have had people in the shelter that have been amazing in the shelter. So that's, you don't want to look away from that. That would be a spontaneous volunteer, and you make them a volunteer or go through the process. Memorandums of understanding, we discussed that. It's important to have that in place prior to the event, but it can be put in place at the event if needed, if there isn't one in place. And I would say, get to know all the possible partners, but constantly try to identify more partners is probably a better word for that. Plan for the future. This should all be in your sheltering plan. Notification, how to notify the public, how to efficiently use resources, how to make sure the shelter is operational, how to get transportation for people or volunteers. I've used the National Guard to transport people. The ice storm in Templeton, they met them at the highway rest area and they transported them in. So that's good. Educate residents, again, all that stuff we discussed. So thank you so much for this training. Good review. Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to end the training on that, but please feel free to follow up. Anything you have. Thank you for all your comments. That's really what makes these trainings work. And this is how all of us that are planners, or even those of us that have a certain role in shelter operations, this is how we get things done and remind ourselves of what we're missing. Because I'm even thinking of stuff I need to do after this training. With that said, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to Christy, and thank you all for your time and your input.
Thanks so
Wonderful.
much, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, awesome.
And for all of our participants, as Corinne had stated earlier, we will get a link out to you in the next day or so. So anyone that joined us late can go back and watch what they missed, or if you wanted to review some of the things we talked about, we will get that taken care of for you.
And
So again, Lisa, thank you so much for your expertise. I think that was some great discussion and gave a lot of food for thought.
Oh, thank you. And I always learn from you all as well. So it's a good information sharing session. So thank you.
All right. Well, everyone have a lovely rest of your night. Unless there's any
Yeah.
other questions.
good to see everybody.
Thank you.